Hello, welcome to ISO 45001, Put Safety First. Our speaker today is Bob Clifford, Assessor and Trainer for Lloyd's Register. Bob has over 30 years of diverse training, auditing, and consulting experience in environmental, occupational safety, and energy management for industrial and service companies in the U.S., Canada, South America, and Asia. Bob has performed hundreds of single and multi-site certification assessments, including initial approval, change to approval, and certificate renewal visits for U.S. and global companies. I will now turn it over to Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Beth, and good day. It's a pleasure to speak with all of you about a very, very important topic, worker safety and well-being. This webcast is derived from a webinar held by Lloyd's Register a few months back and delivered by Steve Williams and Martin Cottam, one a member and the other the new leader of the ISO project and technical committees that were involved in the creation and maintenance of ISO 45001, which is now the international standard for an occupational health and safety, or OHS, management system. As Beth mentioned, I've been a Lloyd's Register assessor and trainer for over 20 years, specializing in environment, energy, and occupational safety. And as a lead OHS assessor for Lloyd's Register, I've conducted numerous certification and compliance audits for companies in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. As well as a trainer, having taught many people about the means to implement and audit their conformance to occupational safety standards. Lloyd's Register, or LR as we refer to ourselves, is a well-established international services and assurance organization. We support numerous business and industrial sectors worldwide, including marine, energy, and food manufacture. And since the 1980s, LR has been a respected and accredited CB, or certification body, approving thousands of certificates of conformance to ISO management system standards, such as ISO 9001 for quality and customer satisfaction, ISO 14001 for environment and sustainability, and now ISO 45001 for worker safety, health, and wellness. And our integrity and credibility is really underscored by the fact that our profits do not serve private investors or public stockholders, but rather the Lloyd's Register Foundation, a wholly independent global charity that supports education, research, public engagement, and scientific excellence in improving safety of the critical infrastructure upon which our modern society relies. Among our client list are leading companies in the U.S. and around the world, including a number of them that I've personally been involved with as either an assessor or a trainer, such as Northrop Grumman, Siemens, Toyota Tsusho, Coca-Cola, and Tallies, to name just a few. The content for today's webinar is to provide you some information and present many of the ideas that were disseminated in the prior webinar, but also to add a few new thoughts that might be of value. These will be related to several topics which we show here, including the development and design of the new ISO standard 45001 for an OHS management system. We'll address the inherent value and the key value-adding elements of OHS management. And I'll try to share where I can the things I've seen as a practicing auditor that organizations like yours do to implement an OHS management system in their organizations. As well, we'll discuss what the journey might be to adopt the new specification, ISO 45001, as your standard for OHS management. Or to adapt your organization's existing OHS management system, were it to have been previously certified conformant to OSAS 18001, which was the initial British standard for OHS management. Now, standards and guidelines for OHS management are not new, but ISO adds a new dimension to it. ISO, which intends to evoke the Greek word isos, meaning equal, is generally used as the acronym for the International Organization for Standardization, a consensus-based standard-setting body. ISO and its imprint on a management standard adds tremendous credibility and value, different from what you might find in other national standards or guidelines. And here, while we trace over 20 years leading up to the development of ISO 45001, in the United States, the program guidelines that established entry into our OSHA's Voluntary Protection Program, or VPP, were defined even further back than that, about 30 years ago in the late 1980s. The four main elements of the VPP guidelines: management commitment and leadership, worker involvement, hazard and risk assessment, training and competency. Each of those are key elements of the national and the international standards that exist today. Other national standards for occupational health and safety have existed for many years, including the British Standard 8800 and subsequently OHS 18001 in the 1990s. Although the UK pushed for an ISO OHS standard, there wasn't sufficient consensus, so OHS 18001 was largely continued as a type of stopgap. But in 2013, ISO commissioned a project committee, PC 283, to develop ISO 45001, and after 5 years of work, the standard was published, as well as a full technical committee now, TC 283, to continue the promulgation and development of OHS management standards, as well as supplementary standards to support ISO 45001. So the culmination of this effort is what we generally refer to as the big three in management system circles: the specifications for customer satisfaction or quality, which is ISO 9001, sustainability and environmental management, which is ISO 14001, and now worker safety, health, and wellness, ISO 45001. 9001 and 14001, by virtue of the fact that they've been around for a while, certainly lead in worldwide certificates of conformance, with respectively over 1 million certifications to ISO 9001 and over 350,000 for ISO 14001. ISO 45001 for occupational health and safety is new, and so it's not really time yet to count number of certificates to it, but expectations are for a rapid adoption, owing to, quite obviously, the universal importance of worker safety, which is recognized in businesses worldwide. And the fact that ISO has now developed a specification for OHS management adds legitimacy for a number of reasons, but one of those is simply the breadth of its global reach and its broad consensus, with participating member countries representing, nations around the world. In addition, ISO was able to obtain the consultation of a number of significant organizations: ILO, the International Labor Organization, the International Trade Union Congress, and IOSH, the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, all of which were participants in development of ISO 45001. So any business decision really requires us to consider risk and reward. Let's look at some of the practices and requirements of ISO 45001, as well as the recognized benefits of implementation and of a certification of conformance. The overall structure of ISO 45001 should not be unique to management system practitioners or safety professionals for that matter. The 7 so-called auditable sections of the standard, from Section 4 context through Section 10 improvement, match the high-level structure of all management system standards that are in common use today, including ISO 9001 and ISO 14001. But even at this high level, worker participation, performance evaluation, improvement, these are recognizable concepts to most every safety professional, no matter what safety program or standard they've studied or utilized. And by design, the structure of ISO 45001 is aligned with the Plan, Do, Check, and Act cycle, PDCA, an iterative 4-step model, also known as the Sheward or Deming cycle, and associated with the concept of TQM, or Total Quality Management. Initially used in the development of ISO 9001, it was a model adopted to define environmental management, ISO 14001, and has since been adopted for occupational health and safety. If you look at the high-level structure of ISO 45001, it's interesting to note that there are more planning sections than any other. Perhaps this is the adage, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Or perhaps underpins the fact that ISO-based standards are sometimes antithetical to how we seem to do business nowadays, which seems to be all about act first and analyze later. Planning is very, very important in a successful management system, according to ISO. And improvement occupies its own spot as a requirement of the standard. Not an improvement as an isolated, opportunistic surprise, but as an expected, informed, and required result of an iterative series of processes, what is essentially a management system. The expected benefits of an OHS management system include those extrinsic benefits often touted by adopting companies. Less being more in EHS, they include reduced incidents, less injuries, less compliance violations. But there are also intrinsic rewards, which are really related to the architecture of an ISO 45001 management system. And these architectural or intrinsic benefits are the true lasting benefits of an OHS management system. They include a structured framework, a more systemic approach to realizing the duty of care that's expected in protecting worker safety and well-being. There's easier alignment of occupational health and safety management with other management standards like 9 and 14001. And therefore the ability to, as I call it, swipe or steal with integrity and pride from everywhere, utilizing some environmental or quality tool sets and concepts that are readily amenable to managing worker safety. We've got the issue of global supply chains. Consumers and purchases are now much more exposed to those variations of OHS performance that occur globally. And organizations may find themselves involved in a supply chain in which OHS performance is an issue that they need to meet a certain level of performance in order to meet stakeholder expectations or as a part of their own brand protection. And one of the main intrinsic benefits that we'll discuss is employee engagement through involvement in OHS management system. That employees are not only engaged, but also empowered, can unleash a powerful force within an organization. And that force is worker pride. The theory that workers who are proud of what they do and where they work will work harder, will work better, will work smarter, and will work safer. So we've looked at the overall or high-level structure of ISO 45001. Now, this structure is defined in Annex SL, essentially one of the appendices to the ISO directive that controls that organization's work. An Annex or Appendix SL codifies a resolve from 2012 that all management system standards, 9001, 14,001, and others, now need to embed certain prescribed commonalities in their structure, in their definitions, and in their text. For a number of reasons, among them to enable them to be more seamlessly integrated, as well as to be more consistently interpreted by users and by auditors. As a practitioner myself, watching companies for years attempt to implement so-called integrated management systems for quality, environment, and safety, the key to Annex SL is opening the doors of what were previously disparate or isolated organizational silos and eliminating the redundancy in multiple policies and procedures, promoting more a sharing of best practices between the disciplines. EHS professionals will recognize this approach as similar to one we know in regulation. In the U.S., it's called primacy, and it's where states take ownership of their own air, water, and waste programs, but must at the core adhere to federal rules common across the country, and can only add but not subtract from the technical and administrative requirements established at the federal level. So very much like that, Annex SL prescribes the common core that must be a part of all ISO management system standards. Then, different committees responsible for the construction of discipline-specific standards can add to or augment that common core based on the needs of their standards. The other benefit that we find in Annex SL is that now that there's a common approach, more and more organizations are able to rate their management systems not to a standard, in other words, not to design it to their specific standard, but instead to crosswalk their existing system to the standard. In other words, defining the standard in terms that make sense to them, and then simply showing where it matches the high-level structure. The requirements of ISO 45001 aren't disengaged clauses and requirements. This, I kind of call it an infographic, which can be found in ISO 45001, really illustrates the dynamic embedded in the standard and occurring between the different sections and requirements. And what you'll see at its heart is PDCA. Planning, doing, checking, and acting, and the clauses that comprise those elements. The driver, though, of the PDCA cycle is now shown in this picture, and it's an organization's understanding of its context. Just like designing a new product, Clause 4 of the standard asks an organization to understand its context, the issues that are associated with the various occupational hazards its workers are subject to, as well as recognizing what are both the needs and obligatory demands of stakeholders. These factors go into the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, and as an output, create what the standard writers call an intended outcome, essentially a goal or business case for adopting a more systemic approach to OHS management. Now, the issues that are related to occupational health and safety can occur from both inside and outside of an organization. Internally, the safety issues or challenges that organizations face largely relate to what the organization does and what it makes, its processes, its products, its manufacturing environment, its working conditions, as well as the extent to which its work is done by outsourced entities, versus employees. The company's governance structure, its overall business goals, its need for profitability, and how it sees safety factoring into those things, its corporate culture and values. Each of these represent internal issues that are going to be critical to basically motivating and forming the overall design and approach a company takes to OHS management. But outside issues and challenges also exist. And among these, new laws and regulations and the changing pace of their promulgation and redefinition is clearly one of those that continue to impact U.S. businesses. Notwithstanding the current political climate, reports indicate that OSHA rulemaking and enforcement remain relatively consistent over the past several years. And so laws and regulatory compliance continue to be a commanding issue when organizations look at occupational health and safety. Supply chains and the overall market still respect and demand organizations have good safety records. And the new workforce that are arriving into businesses today are armed with a new knowledge and expectation that their employers are obligated and need to provide them with a safe and healthy working environment. And in what is a worker-friendly hiring environment, preferred employers, I should say, will be the organization. Now, who are then the stakeholders or interested parties to an OHS management system? Well, these will be groups and individuals who work in, visit, or have an interest in the safety that your workplace provides. This list here is not exhaustive, and in fact, there could be multiple dimensions to each of these categories of interested parties. Contractors, for example, could include those who simply do odd jobs, as well as those that are often called resident contractors. And the views of those two parts of one party could be different and could be different influencers. And I think everyone knows that a workforce in most organizations is not homogeneous. Especially if the organization is unionized, if it has language or nationality differences. Each of those components of his workforce could represent and have a unique viewpoint on OHS, occupational health and safety, in their workplace. Now, one of the more challenging elements of the standard, and for the standard writers as we understand it, was the element of worker involvement in the system. Notwithstanding the challenge in engaging a broad and multidimensional workforce, the benefit of engaging employees in safety is second nature, not only to those of us familiar with ISO management systems, but those of us who practice safety. And that's really because leadership and the involvement of people have been long-standing quality principles associated with ISO 9001 since the 1990s, as well as one of the four pillars of the program guidelines to the United States' VPP program. So the importance of these two elements really can't be understated. And if we go back to the infographic, we can see Section 5 of the standard, ISO 45001, leadership and worker participation, clearly positioned at the hub of the Deming cycle, and clearly demarcating this element's importance to an OHS management system. You can see it demonstrates or indicates a point of connection with all the other elements of the PDCA cycle, clearly denoting the need for both the leadership team and the workforce to have demonstrable activities in all parts of the system. Definitions in ISO management standards provide meaning and provide context, and so they're tremendously important. None less than the definition of worker, which is the focal point of an OHS management system, and one that you can see is very, very broadly drawn. The challenge here is not limiting the definition of worker to terms that we have in common use or that have specific connotations, like employee or contractor, for example. The standard rather defines the concept or idea of worker much more broadly and situationally. You can see that it includes paid or unpaid, regular or temporary workers, as well as workers who may come from external providers, who aren't employed by us, but are working for us as we employ or contract with their employers. For example, the person who's arrived to check out a furnace or a boiler. And the definition of worker hinges on the concept of control. A worker is someone over which the organization has some degree of control, therefore a fairly low bar, not necessarily one that requires any type of legal definition, but just practically speaking, if we as an organization have the ability to define or to tell an individual what or where they'll need to do work, they're under some degree of control, and therefore we have some degree of responsibility. With regards to worker involvement, the standard has actually two words, two verbs, and demonstrable activities associated with each that are applied to workers. These are the definitions 3.4 and 3.5 in the standard, and those words are participation and consultation. Just as a quick sidelight, this illustrates an improvement to the writing of the standard, which was incorporated with the high-level structure. And it's an attempt to include order and priority in defining requirements. So Section 5 of the standard defines both participation and consultation. And participation comes first in the definitions as well. And so that clearly indicates it's the stronger of the requirements. And it requires that workers be empowered in the decision-making process for some parts of the OHS system. Now, the standard also defines consultation, somewhat less powerful, and suggesting that for some parts of the system, worker input should be solicited, although the workers need not be formally incorporated into the decision-making process. Now, in our training classes, we frequently deal with implementation of a management system, and so here are a few tips on how to go about that for ISO 45001. I worked extensively with small, resource-limited businesses, and so I'm very used to finding ways to get two for the price of one. At the risk of seeming cute, I would suggest that the place to start implementing an OHS management system is by implementing the very first section of ISO 45001, Section 4 and context of the organization. In fact, each of the four clauses in Section 4 lays out the design requirements of the system, beginning with context and understanding the issues that the OHS system needs to address. So when looking at context, is yours a risky business? Is it relatively hazard-free? What's been your track record with safety? How exposed to regulation? How is your industrial sector perceived? Is that a bias you want to turn about? And then who are your stakeholders, your interested parties? Certainly they're your workforce, but what about regulators? What about the community from which you draw your employees? What about your up and downstream supply chains? In other words, just like product design, what is it that the market requires from your system? It's deliverable, which is ensuring that in whatever enterprise you're in, your people stay safe. And what do your customers want, your stakeholders? This consideration that's required in Section 4 of the standard creates really a type of business case that can be essential in both motivating you to develop an OHS management system defining its parameters and boundaries, but also can be used as an ongoing benchmark when you gauge effectiveness of the system during management review. Then the next step is a gap analysis. Much of ISO 45001 is not new news. These are things that any organization in any regulatory jurisdiction are already doing. The goal then is simply to fill the gaps. And those next steps include developing a plan. When, who, and what are we going to do to fill the gaps, align our system with the standard, and if so, possibly certify conformance. Bear in mind the value of the teaming approach. Involve workers early and often in developing the system that will be used to protect them. Use what you have. The first thing should not be to create an ISO set of documentation. Use the programs, the procedures, the policies you already have and weave them into your system. And finally, remember measurement. One of Deming's principles was you can't manage what you don't measure. And so we're not only talking here of measurement on a macro level, incident statistics, reportable lost work days. These are things we're used to collecting, but also, and borrowing a tip from the quality management discipline, measuring leading and lagging indicators related to specific key safety programs that we can use to gauge both their conformance as well as their effectiveness. OHS 18001 has been, for a generation, since 1999, a bit of a stopgap, while a consensus to create an international or ISO standard was reached. Many organizations, therefore, who have systemic OHS management systems modeled theirs on OHS 18001. And so here are just a few notes about some of the key differences and enhancements. Outside the many differing requirements, one thing to note is that ISO 45001 is a new ISO standard, whereas the previous OHS 18001 was not. This is important, though, because ISO 45001 now has the visibility and the credibility that other standards, like 9 and 14001, also offer. And as we mentioned, the new high-level or Annex SL structure is a key difference maker because it now provides a consistent and globally accepted format, if you will, for a management system. One that organizations can crosswalk their system to, and again, show credibility and reliability. One thing to look for during your gap analysis would be, of course, some removed requirements, although these are relatively few, such as the need to have specific procedures or define a unique individual called a management representative. These are still things to take into account. New requirements have been added, and we've talked a bit about those: context, consultation, and participation of workers, and the value that that can have. And some existing requirements are expressed differently. Competence and training, for example, and these potentially nuances in wording may or may not have meaning, and then may or may not have an impact or a significant benefit to your organization. We've discussed context and worker engagement. Bear in mind, risk remains a key factor in ISO 45001. And the importance of determining relative risk among many workplace hazards, which is a key element of most all management models, including OHS 18001 and the US VPP, is still found in ISO 45001. But now the standard associates opportunity with risk. So again, the value in considering both reward in concert with looking at risk. And it also expands the consideration of risk beyond the very tactical calculation that we're familiar with, severity and likelihood. That's still appropriate to look at, but the standard writers also advise us to look at the broader, more strategic or organizational risks, reputation, profitability. Our awareness and valuing of these can be critical to both the design and development of our system, as well as its ongoing improvement and effectiveness. On top of the new Clause 4 is Clause 5, Leadership, which lays out essentially a checklist of demonstrable actions that our leadership team, executives, for example, at an organization, must not only undertake, but be able to provide proof of. And in our training classes, I always point towards the verbs that are in the requirements assigned to leadership. Develop, promote, protect. Each of these are actionable, each of these are demonstrable, and each of these are tied directly to the actions of the leadership team. Indirectly, there are also several instances where the word ensure appears. These are elements that are not necessarily directly actionable by leadership, but ensure connotes the need for accountability to be retained by the leadership team. And so, should the requirement to ensure something happen or fail to happen, consequences need be associated with that. And control. Controlling our operations in order to achieve a manageable level of occupational health and safety risk are really at the heart of ISO 45001, as it is for other management standards. The hierarchy of control that safety professionals are familiar with is referred to by name and defined in ISO 45001. There's a specific section highlighting the importance of managing change, which safety professionals already recognize, particularly organizations that are involved in process safety management, and recognizing that a lot of work in the workplace is done potentially outside the immediate workplace or by contracted organizations. There's a specific section that talks about how we manage those business partnerships to ensure safety is preserved. And finally, hazard identification and the monitoring of performance are not so much different as they're simply expanded, making sure that we look at all workers, not necessarily those who are simply employees, and in performance evaluation, considering broader strategic trends as well as the tactical day-to-day data when we're making decisions on both the effectiveness and the steps or actions to improve the system. So as it was with ISO 9001 and 14001, when they underwent their major revisions in 2015, organizations that already have certificated conformance to the OHS 18001 precursor can elect to move to conformance with ISO 45001. Now, unlike 9 and 14001, where the move was termed transition, the term used for ISO 45001 is migration. And the difference here is the connotation that ISO 45001 is more than just an advancement to a next revision, but a move to a new standard, one that now has the imprint of the ISO organization and the integrity that's associated with that. As it was for 9001 and 14001, the International Accreditation Forum, or IAF, and so the world's accreditation and certification bodies have allowed a 3-year period within which certificates of conformance to OHS 18001 can still be recognized. That period then would extend from the publication of ISO 45001, which occurred on March 12, 2018, until March of 2021. Now, as the date of this webcast, we're in 2019, so we're already 1/3 of the way through that migration period. And of course, 2021 should not be considered the due date for certification, but simply the outside limit for maintaining a valid certification to an accepted specification, in this case, OHS 18001. One position to possibly advocate for in your organization is that ISO 45001 represents the culmination of years of collating global best practices in OHS management. It might be best then to look at ISO 45001 not like a new regulation, where often we consider what do I need to do and when do I have to do it by, but rather what does the international standard say? What is the international community determined to be these best practices? How can it benefit my organization? And how soon do I want to start reaping the benefits? That mindset may really help to support our understanding of how this new standard holds both tremendous implications but also tremendous value for our organization, and will help us best establish the business case for moving forward. Another consideration might also be that ISO 45001 is not entirely new. Hazard identification, training, safety audits. These have been elements common and integral to OHS management, whether your organization was following a standard or had a systemic program, or were simply working to comply with regulations. And so a number of these, including a number of these elements that had been requirements of OHS 18001, are already part of your OHS system. There are others, like the ones we've touched upon, leadership, worker engagement, that are new, if you will, or unique to ISO 45001, but may or may not, to some degree, be unique or new to your organization. And so the decision to proceed ahead may not be one that comes with it the worry about a significant amount of resources, a significant amount of change, to your company. So we would strongly suggest that organizations, whether you're new to OHS standards or previously adopted OHS 18001, seek knowledge and understanding and make the best business decision for you. We can provide training about ISO 45001, training that's focused on how ISO 45001 differs from OHS 18001, as well as training on how to implement a conformance system and how to audit that conformance. Some of our courses are certified to criteria established by CQI, the Chartered Quality Institute, and IRCA, the International Register of Certificated Auditors, and attendance at those courses enable attendees to obtain or maintain professional auditor certification. A preliminary assessment or a gap analysis is yet another service that we provide. As the name suggests, it looks at gaps between your current OHS system and programs and the requirements of ISO 45001. I've done a number of these preliminary assessments, including some to ISO 45001, and I can point out that I find I not only point out gaps, but also point out where existing management processes in an organization could fill those gaps. For example, many companies have adopted the lean disciplines, like value stream mapping or 5S. but look at those as more of a quality tool set. In reality, 5S can have tremendous value in improving workplace organization, situational awareness, and as a result, employee safety. And then finally, independent third-party certification to ISO 45001 will still follow the usual two-step or two-stage process. Although organizations that previously adopted and certified their conformance to OHS 18001 may receive allowances that will enable them to complete that in one step or one stage. So that ends this part of the presentation, and Beth, I think we can take on a few questions that have come up regarding ISO 45001.
We sure can. Thank you, Bob. The first question is, does ISO 45000 have an emphasis on legal compliance, or is it more focused on improvement cycles?
Well, the standard certainly continues to have an emphasis on legal compliance. Like OHS 18001, ISO 45001 requires that a company commit to compliance in its policy, have a process to understand its compliance obligations, its legal requirements, as well as having a process to evaluate or monitor its compliance status. And so auditors, conformance auditors, will look at not only those processes and whether or not they exist, but also whether or not they are effective. That is, that the organization is realizing a state of legal compliance. Different from a compliance audit, of course, a system assessment will not check on every piece of legal compliance, and were an issue with legal compliance be identified, that's not a finding in an audit report. Rather, what conformance auditors are trained to do is to evaluate what might be the system issue that caused that non-compliance to occur. So legal compliance, as well as the process of improving the degree to which a company complies with its requirements, are both still parts of ISO 45001.
Okay, thank you. Second question is, how could we articulate the case for ISO 45001 when we don't really have any serious OH&S incidents in our workplace?
Well, the business case for ISO 45001 might not need relate to a bad track record. In fact, prevention of injuries and not response to worker injuries is or ought to be the goal of most organizations. And so really the question there is, how sure is an organization that their limited number of serious safety incidents is related to their system and programs versus how much is it related to sheer luck? And how sure are they that their workers are adequately protected? That assurance is widely regarded as being connected to the effectiveness of the management system that's in place and underlies an organization.
Okay, great. Our final question is, how can ISO 45001 help raise awareness of mental health issues within businesses?
Well, as the name suggests, mental health, emotional health, each have the word health in them, and so are definitely within the purview of a standard that looks at occupational health and safety. And I think from a general point of view, we've become more alert and more comfortable recognizing that there are issues of mental health that can affect the workplace that people are in. And so I think, along with safety and health, wellness, mental health, emotional security are all parts or can be parts of the ongoing development of an OHS management system. Of note, the technical committee, which is now responsible, as I mentioned, for ongoing maintenance and development of OHS management standards, has begun work on one other. In addition to 45001, the planned ISO 45003 will provide guidance. So it'll be a guidance standard on psychological health in the workplace, an area that's perhaps a new frontier for traditional safety professionals, but nevertheless one that is important and therefore guidelines that may be able to provide tremendous value to organizations.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob, for all that helpful information. And if you would like more information, please visit our website, www.lrqausa.com, or you can see the contact information there on your screen. Thank you for joining us for this webcast. Goodbye.